Hello and welcome back to Breaking Ground on iPropertyRadio with myself, Carol Tallon, the show where we chat to industry experts to get a view on what's happening on the ground and to learn about new trends emerging within the construction industry. This show is brought to you in partnership with Place Engage, a data-driven platform for more successful public consultation and community engagement for your next development project. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by returning guest Robert Colleran of Robert Colleran Property Consultants to talk about the development land market. Robert, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
No, thanks very much for having me on, Carol.
So Robert, you're always our go-to person when we're looking to understand the development land market, and understanding the development land market is very important for being able to accurately assess our pipeline looking ahead over the next year to 2 to 3. So maybe we could just start by understanding how the development land market performed in 2023 and maybe what that can tell us about the future pipeline.
Yeah, I suppose it's probably underperformed an extent, and there's been a lot of changes there. So I suppose what you have is the vulture funds, as you call them, are the large investors. They're being replaced by the state, and the state as a body is coming. It's 40 to 50% of the apartment market anyway. So I suppose it's a new backer in town for a lot of the smaller developers, especially in particular for the apartment market. So if you look at incentives that are there, for apartment building, creating and other schemes, if the state weren't there, these schemes, a lot of them wouldn't get built. And I'm talking about your city centre, higher density apartment schemes. Whereas I think just generally, the housing side of it is strong, and the planning regulations for housing are probably easier. The fire rating, the fire stopping, and then I think even with the housing side of it, there's huge improvements. I think the increase in density, I suppose reduction in wall to wall for 22 to 16 meters in distance, less parking, more amenities, smaller garden sizes. I think generally the planning is starting to turn, but it's just slow. It's a slow turn. But in the meantime, a lot of developers are relying on the state for our approved housing bodies in a lot of cases for how do you say, a takeout. So, they're
Yeah.
looking at a scheme and they're assessing it, and they're working out what it'll take to make it work, and then they're trying to align with an approved housing body that will allow them to forward fund the development and then build out, making a profit, but also providing amenities. So the likes of Respond, Cluid, Tua, Focus Ireland Elderly, they're all the end users, and they're benefiting from the development market.
Yeah, there's some really interesting dynamics, and you touched on a few things there that I want to unpack because it's confusing. Sometimes the data coming out can be confusing. So only this week we learned, I don't think it's a secret, but it was reported that Irish homes are just being built to a much higher standard than the UK, and so that makes them more expensive to deliver. And on the flip side of that, in the latter part of 2023, Turner and Townsend had a report that showed that actually across the Eurozone, Ireland had, I think, the second lowest labour costs, which was really surprising. So actually, that's pointing us to contractors being able to deliver projects. And while there's a shortage of labour, the labour isn't the largest cost, that actually you're looking at regulatory costs and delays as being really the factors that are pushing projects into the territory of being of not being viable, and that's a real
Mm.
problem at the moment. So take the standards and regulate the standards out of it, because we are there has been an overcorrection in terms of building standards, and we know why that has happened, and it has been necessary to improve, but perhaps we have gone into the territory of overcorrection. But the biggest systemic delay is planning. So
Yeah.
when you're meeting people who are either buying or selling development land, what are they, how do they interpret Ireland's planning system?
It's changing, but at the same time, a lot of people are caught in on board Planola or judicial review. It's the timeline taken. Like if you're an external investor and you're looking at Ireland, and then you're saying, well, okay, you have to get your planning with Dublin City Council, then it goes to the board, and then there could be an on board Planola appeal, and then the big thing was judicial review. So that timeline could be, 3 to 4 years, which is it's not functional. And the big thing is the interest rate levels at the moment where they're at, and it's the cost of funding. So if you're saying to your funder that this development is going to take an extra 12 to 18 months to build out until you get your return, it's the cost of financing that development. And if you look at some of the larger schemes like Player Wills or Cherrywood in some cases, or RTE, these are massive developers in there that can afford it. But at the same time, if it was a smaller developer, to fund an extra 18 months or 2 years on top of a development plan, it would hurt you. And then it's knowing that you have either a site with full planning permission that's ready to go, or else having to agree terms with a subject to planning permission sale, which will allow you better finance and forward funding, and knowing that, when I buy the site, I can build it out with 18 months, and Irish Water and connections and services and everything is all there. So that's the big go-to at the moment. A lot of the sites that are selling are being sold subject to planning permission or with planning permission already there. In particular, the apartment sites, because it's more difficult to get planning permission for apartments. And then you mentioned also the regulations. So the regulations for apartments are tighter, obviously, with fire stopping, fire rates, and the level of build costs involved in them. So
when you're meeting sellers, are most of them selling because it was in their kind of strategic plan to sell, or are they actually doing a U-turn? Are they changing their minds and not proceeding with developments that it had been within their plan to proceed with?
it could be a case where they're not making enough profit on it, and they might have a figure in mind where they want to get out. So they could have amalgamated a site at the right time. So it might be a case where they have for instance, they might have a site and it could have had planning permission. They got planning granted for 50 units. It went to Bord Planola. They'll only get 40 units in it now. So they could say, okay, if I can get 2.8 million for the site, I'll offload it and sell it, because the margin of profit that they're going to make on it isn't enough. So it could be a case where there could be a planning change. In some cases that's the case, or else it's the case that somebody's been, working on a site to get the planning permission. They have the planning permission now and they have to sell it. But the big problem is, you're trying to talk to a vendor at the moment, and they were told that their site was worth X amount 2 years ago, and now you're seeing that the value of the site has to be reduced by 15, 20, or even 30% based on the cost of construction, the finance costs, the interest rates that are there. But I think what will happen is, like, the level of demand, the level of pent-up demand is there. But at the moment, it's very hard to value a site when the interest rates are still bouncing around the top. I think when interest rates start coming down a bit, your evaluation or your development appraisal of the site will become more set in stone. So you can say, okay, it's not going to increase. If anything, the value of the cost input is going to decrease on the site, and it become more sure of making profit. Because a lot of people have been caught out in the rising market when interest rates have increased, and their model or their finance model has been pushed back with planning. So
what does that tell us then about the people buying those sites and the companies buying those sites? Because I presume there's a difference in scale for maybe some of the smaller sites and some of the larger sites. So who's stepping in to take those on?
I suppose it's down to the risk level. So any developer has to take a large amount of risk on buying a site at the right time, but also looking at all the development variables, putting in your contingency of 5%, allowing for interest rate fluctuations. So there's a high risk involved. So what's happening in a lot of cases, a lot of smaller developers are relying on a takeout from an approved housing body, a Respond, Clúid, to Focus Ireland Elderly. There's 20 go-tos of it. So they're nearly lining up and agreeing a price now that will be paid on practical completion for each unit, each house, each apartment site. So they're nearly trying to de-risk, relying on the open market.
In terms of risk, what are the risk factors that are kind of top of mind for developers right now? Because, last year we saw, and over 18 months, kind of interest rates was certainly a huge one. Regulatory uncertainty, judicial reviews, absolutely for sure, our planning regime. What are the risk factors that are rising to the top, knowing that we're entering into an interesting political year as well?
It's still planning. Planning would be first and foremost. It's planning delays, third-party appeals and board planola, judicial reviews. Okay, I think that's getting fixed. But at the same time, you look at prime time, you look at, you look at guys who are putting the boot in, looking for payoffs nearly to drop their planning appeals. So, it's the lengths of time that it has to take to finance a project if there's going to be planning delays. The other side of it is, okay, you're going to have a general election in 15 months, and there'll probably be, that uncertainty. Uncertainty isn't good for any market. That's another side of it. And then it's a case of labor costs. I think construction costs are starting to come down in terms of materials. There's still a huge shortage of labor. I think you probably need, if you're going to meet the target of 120,000 units by 2030, we don't have enough labor in the construction industry in Ireland at the moment, maybe to reach that level without, I suppose, modular building or different methods of construction. But I think we're going to be under pressure with planning and with labour to build out within that time frame. There's not enough, there's not enough entrance into the construction market from schools, colleges, or labour from that side of it. We need to import labour, because if you look at population growth, you're probably 5.5 million. Population is increasing 60,000 odd a year. The requirement for housing, I think we only built 32,000. We're going to aim for 35,000 next year. It's a cap. We can't fix it in the short term, so it's going to be like that for the next year or so.
But there are definitely ways that could improve it. And I think you touched on it there, actually, by employing off-site construction and other modern methods of construction. One of those would be modular, but it's not the only, it's one of a number of solutions there. So that's certainly a way to scale without that dependency on on labour to the same extent. And this isn't an Irish problem. This is a global problem, I suppose, just to
It's
put it in
worldwide.
context.
If you look at UK, it's the same thing there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I just saw last night in the Irish Times that finally, I mean, it's been touted for a while, and it's been said on stages and panel discussions and at government meetings, but actually, it's now been formalised that Ireland needs to spearhead the adoption of modern methods of construction and off-site construction. And, that's been championed through kind of a direct build social housing programme, and that's coming directly from the social and economic think tank task. So we know that that's one that's very influential in guiding government policy, because this goes beyond the housing department. It's all of the departments require buildings and infrastructure. So actually this, and it's interesting, you touched on uncertainty in the context of the political arena, and we know we're coming into a national general election in the next kind of 18 months or thereabouts. But what I'm seeing on the ground, because there was more fear about this a year or 2 years ago, but what I'm seeing on the ground now is there seems to be a better understanding that the Housing for All targets, Housing for All is a multi-party approach, including Sinn Féin. So actually, if they remain the dominant party, and do end up in power, actually they have been party to Housing for All. So there shouldn't be a huge change in terms of the targets, how
No, the
they're
policies
delivered,
are
the
there.
infrastructure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think the policies are there. If you look at Cunha,
yeah.
that's a very positive. Shared equity schemes, affordable
Mm,
purchase schemes. There's about 10 different
yeah,
moving parts to it. Okay, the problem is there's so many people go for affordable housing that it could only be half or two-thirds that apply for it
mm,
will end up getting into the schemes. But at the same time, you know, the government have done a lot in a short space of time. And if that political pressure wasn't there, maybe they mightn't be as under as much pressure to perform to produce these
possibly.
provisions.
Yeah.
But at the same time, affordable housing isn't a problem just in Ireland. You look at the UK, you look at other countries. It's a case of your mortgage lending criteria versus your cost of construction versus. But if you look at your standard apartment cost, an apartment built to sell in Ireland just won't happen because the cost of construction versus the sale price doesn't stack up. So without the government stepping in or without certain parameters there, a lot of these apartments just won't get built.
Yeah, I know that's a very fair point. We've touched on it there, but obviously planning has been a basket case in Ireland.
Mm.
On board Planola has not been it hasn't been the leader that a planning regime needs. So we have the new planning and development bill, and it is the third largest piece of legislation
Mm.
in Ireland's history. But the Irish Examiner have done a really good deep dive into the planning and
Yeah.
development bill over the last week or two, and they were documenting the 388 changes already or
Mm.
amendments already put forward by the housing department. And now,
It's
don't get me
huge if you
wrong,
look at the
yeah,
context of it. And even at that, they've Owen O'Brien saying, the six parts that they're missing or it's not fit for purpose. So,
yeah.
it's a huge amount that they've done within a short space of time. So, you have to give them some credit for it.
But on the ground, your home builders, your developers, how are they receiving this? Do they think this is going to solve their problem?
No, but they think it's an improvement. So I don't think it's everything's fixed, but I think it's getting there. But in the meantime, there's pent-up demand. If you look at GDP, stable, employment is positive, interest rates probably come down, level of inflation. You can see it with your materials, your construction materials, but just generally,
Mm.
your heating costs will start coming down, your shopping costs will start coming down. So, towards the second half of this year, it'll probably become a bit more affordable, or you might have more certainty in the market as to where we're heading. So that combined with planning policy will certainly help.
And certainty is a big one for sure. You touched on something earlier as well. You just mentioned it, and and I'm curious. The prime time piece that actually exposed some of the objectors to be less than genuine. How
Yeah, it's a case. Yeah, but
how
even at
how
that, it's
surprised? How surprised were you? Because I feel like this is the worst kept secret um in development in Ireland, that actually developers have had really they've suffered from poor public perception since
mm,
the crash, and essentially before that, to the point where they didn't feel they could defend themselves when they were being subjected to very
mm.
bad behavior. And primetime really exposed that. It showed that actually developers and home builders who were trying to deliver schemes were actually being essentially blackmailed.
Well, being targeted
No,
for
yeah,
the scheme, but it's too loose. The bar in a lot of cases was too low, and anybody can object to a scheme. Be it a wind farm, be it a data center. You could have an objection coming in from Cork to something that's in Dublin that
yeah.
has no impact on person. And then you're wondering why is the link here? What's the objection for? Or what's the cost level to raise a um, a judicial review of a
Yeah.
scheme. So yeah, it highlights exactly where where the problems are in the system. Hopefully that'll help implement changes that are there. But
Yeah.
at the same time, you need a performing planning system within a set time frame. At the moment, we're trying to get there, but as I mentioned, there's a huge log jam of
Mm.
smaller schemes in with An Bord Pleanála that are just getting kicked to touch. Whereas I think the newer schemes in the next 6 to 9 months will move quicker at a
Mm.
set time for the larger developers. But the smaller developers might be left behind or caught in limbo between the two.
And
But then,
that,
as well as that, it's the infrastructure that's there. It's a case that, this level of demand that's there, if you're looking at the report in the Times yesterday, if there's 120,000 units there, and they're targeting, commuter belts in
mm,
areas around transport infrastructures that haven't been built out yet. So you're talking about Metro North or DART extensions, or, in around that kind of commuter belt hour travel time. We're still behind it in terms of Metro North or DART extensions, or extensions out to Drogheda or the likes of that. Yeah.
yeah. The smaller developments that you referenced, because we know priority within our board plan has been given to
Hmm.
larger developments. For the smaller ones that have been caught there for, nearly a year, sometimes longer, will they need to be re-examined, from a viability, from in the context of local supply and demand, in the context of the changing marketplace? When the extent of the delay is that long, by the time they actually do get looked at by An Bord Pleanála, are they going to be the right? Will that project be the right project for the environment, knowing that there's been maybe an 18-month delay?
It'll certainly put a lot of pressure on the developer to make a profit. So it'll hit their profit because the cost of interest and funding it will be more.
Mm,
The only thing that they'd hope for is that might balance out with the cost of construction coming down. Maybe materials for construction might come
okay.
down, or labor, but it doesn't benefit anybody to have a site sitting there for 3, 4 years. And as I said, the viability in some schemes, and then it's a case they're under pressure to build out because they're going to get taxed on the site.
Mm.
So that
Yeah.
there's other pressures there. So
And it's interesting, like it doesn't serve anybody, not the state, not the industry, and definitely not the end consumers, because we still have
mm,
this chronic shortage of housing.
mm.
Robert, I'm very conscious of time,
Well,
but there is
the government
something,
would probably have to come in and,
yeah,
the government would have to take up the slack of it. So the taxpayer is going to have to take up the slack for a lot of these sites to get built out. And then
that,
it's the same sites are being pushed to, it's the approved housing bodies that are being the end buyer. But these
yeah,
are for a lot of the apartment sites, whereas the average home builder, you build a house, the minute you finish it, if it's valued for 400,000 to 600,000, there's a sweet spot there. And if you look at the developers that are there, your Cairn, your Glenveaghs, they're building very high quality houses in the right locations, and they're all A rated up to a very high standard. And then it's a case with the densities coming in. There's a push towards smaller housing units in further out locations. So, you're getting more demand for your 2-bed houses,
mm.
smaller front and back gardens, less parking, less distance between houses. So you're getting more on the site, but they're good quality built houses at an A-rated standard. So,
Absolutely. And I think compact housing better reflects where Irish people or
mm,
people living in Ireland are, as opposed to maybe the high density that was trying to be pushed previously. So I think
mm.
compact housing is where we need to be looking at, particularly on the peripheries of our cities and going into larger market towns.
Well, with
Um,
COVID as well, there's been a move,
mm,
a slight move away from apartment living. And then, if you look at it, the build to rent market, which was being driven by institutional investors, it's just not there, because if you look at the price cap, the rent caps that are in, and then investors, you only have to look at some of the IRES REITs or some of the groups, the investors want a return. If inflation is higher than the rent cap, a lot of these aren't attractive enough.
I'm glad you touched on that as COVID being a bit of a turning point, because actually I believe that it genuinely created a shift in what people want and what they're willing to do. And honestly, I'm not convinced over the last 2 decades, I'm not convinced that Irish homeowners ever chose apartments. I think they would have the vast majority of people were funneled into apartments because that's where their budget was and that's what the supply
I
was.
think
But I
it's your
think they
starter
would have
market,
chosen.
or it's your how to say it's your foreign worker. But like if you look at Dublin Docklands in the background there, you watch Owen Riley's reports and you look at how many buyers, a lot of the mom and pops are getting out of the market. They sell on their apartment. A lot of the buyers are foreign workers here. Look, you can check the stats on it,
Yeah,
but there's
yeah.
a growing move. Like the build to rent market, the returns aren't quite there at the moment. And if you look at the price caps, or sorry, the rent caps, it's not as attractive as it was in the last 3 4 years. So there's a new move towards it, and a lot of the move is more going towards house building or approved housing bodies. That's where the apartment market seems to be heading.
Well, I know I'm conscious of time, but that is
Yeah.
something I want to talk to you about, particularly when we turn our attention outside of Dublin to maybe some of to the greater Dublin area, but also to some of the regional cities and larger market towns. There's a really interesting trend of development specifically for social housing. So you might just talk us through that.
Yeah, I suppose it's a case that commuter towns, a lot of these commuter towns, I suppose the sale price for a house in a commuter town mightn't reach the market level, but with an approved housing body, they'll pay that price level that will match the construction costs. So if you're in, say, Kildare, the cost of construction and build versus this resale price, the margin of profit mightn't be enough. But if you're selling to an approved housing body, they'll pay that level because it's at that level. And then you're getting to other, if you're looking at Cork and you're looking at development along the Docklands or other areas that are there. But generally speaking, the commuter belts, a lot of the approved housing bodies are, they're, an hour and a half from Dublin, where they're borderline on what price level they can achieve in the market versus what's there. If you're talking Midlands, an approved housing body might be prepared to pay that bit more than where the open market for the house sale would pay.
And
Some cases.
just because I think the model is an interesting one because it feels
Mm.
new, but actually it's probably quite an old development model where you
Mm.
actually have the home builders. So, I mean, we're saying developers, but the reality on the ground is that these are local home builders essentially most of the
In most
time.
cases, they
Are
are.
they
They're
are
proven
they owning
builders. Yeah.
are they
Yeah.
owning or buying their sites?
Well, the developer is buying the site, knowing that they've already an agreement in place with an approved housing body to purchase the property on practical completion. But they're going to be building, like for most new developments anyway, 20% of the scheme is effectively your part five. So this case, they might be building out knowing that 30, 40 houses in a certain area are going to be state owned. And I can see smaller developers like Fitzhealy or somebody else, they're building these schemes, good high quality schemes up to a very high standard, well built and passed on to an approved housing body.
Okay, and we know the approved housing bodies are directly housing people from the local authorities
Hmm.
housing list. So essentially, it is the local authorities housing delivery. So it's hitting those targets. But in terms of, I suppose, the benefits, yes, you've got the benefit of your end customer, but are there other benefits? So, for example, in terms of, is there a priority in terms of infrastructure, or, do we know, is this less likely to run into planning delays? Like, are there other benefits?
Well, there's certain areas, so they'd have to be on good public transport beside shopping facilities,
Mm,
in a certain case, but it can't all be the same. It can't all be an approved housing body because then it would create social issues, So in different county councils, so be it Drogheda, they'd only have a remit to allow a certain amount within a year, and then it's capped. So everything is monitored. So, you might have a window there or a certain amount that you can fill, and then the rest will be, built to sell. Your a certain amount of housing estates are built to sell. There's only, a certain percentage that will be allowed be sold fully for an approved housing body. But even recently, people were up in arms with Ryanair buying 25 apartments in a small scheme. But it's all down to affordability for a certain for certain cohorts, for your average worker.
what are you expecting? I suppose, kind of final question.
Hmm.
What are your expectations, and I suppose the expectations of the developers that you're dealing with for 2024 and 2025, knowing that we are in the political situation that we're in, knowing that the planning and development bill is still only at bill stage and we already have 388 amendments to that. So what are the expectations, and what can we expect for 2024 and 2025?
I think there's going to be more state purchase. The land development LDA are going to play a bigger role in large scale strategic sites. If you look at two of the big sales last year, um, they were talking Clongriffin, 27 acres, 38 million, Rathbeal Road, 62 acres, and Swords, 30 million. So the state are coming more into play.
Mhm.
And then it's a case that the home builder more move for higher density 2 3 bed housing, commuter belts, and more larger scale house building. You mentioned that area, Clongriffin, Swords, commuter belt areas, but it's still huge pent up demand. Like if you had a new housing site in Swords, there's huge demand there from house buyers. Your first time buyer market is huge. The level of mortgage rate approvals, I think it's 600, 700, 800 a week are getting approval for it, and then it's a case that there's not enough supply there. So I think the house building market or housing supply will be strong. Do we reach that 35 level? I think we might be under pressure to do so, but I think, there's demand in the market. The demographics are very strong. I think there's going to be more subject to planning site sales, and then it's a case as interest rates come down, you might see more certainty in development. So you get a lot of the bigger developers that might have been sitting back, wait and see, or they might have been busy with 5 or 6 other sites and waiting till the market comes down. They might start coming back into the market a bit more. So I'll see a strong second half of the year, but it could be another tough first and second quarter for the development land market, with
Okay.
a lot of subject to planning sales.
Yeah, and look, certainty is kind of the magic word there. Are are most of the development sites available? Are they sold publicly in the open market, or is there much happening off market?
There's a lot off market, because unless something has full planning permission, like if you have a site with full planning permission, you put it out to market. But a lot of these, most people, most agents in the sales market, they kind of have a short list of who's buying. But yeah, there's still a lot of churn on the off market side. But a lot of that is smaller. What's happening at the moment is smaller site sales than the big tranche. There's not as many, 30, 40, 50, 60 acre sites being sold. A lot of the site sales are smaller, but they're transacting along, but it's at a lower price level. So I think as the market goes on to the second half of the year, you might see developers, sorry, landowners that might have gotten their planning permission, gotten it ready for market, and then, deciding that it's the right time to sell. So there's a bit of that too, where they might say, well, it's the wrong time to sell in quarter 1 or 2 while the interest rates are still high. Let's get the planning in order, get your paperwork in order, and look to launch for sale later in the year.
Do you have any interesting sites at the moment that you think have
Yeah,
pretty strong
plenty, like North
potential?
County, Dublin, commuter belts, apartment sites. But what I'm finding is I'm struggling to sell the smaller sites without planning permission, especially for apartments. You need to nearly sell those subject to planning permission. But anything that's kind of commuter belt or suburbs, for housing in particular, should sell well.
Very good. Okay, Robert, I always learn so much every time I
No
talk to you.
problem.
And I think you really, when you talk to us about the development land, it's a really good kind of bellwether guide to what we can expect in terms of new homes delivery kind of over the 24 to 36 months. So genuinely, thank you. I always appreciate those insights. That's all we have time for today. My thanks to Robert Colleran of Robert Colleran Property Consultants, and also thanks to show producer Katie Tallon and to the production team at Hear Me Roar Media. Also,
Thanks
thanks
very
to Place
much.
Engage. Thank you, Robert. Thanks to Place Engage for making these conversations possible. And thank you indeed for tuning in. We'll catch you on the next episode of Breaking Ground. In the meantime, please be sure to check out all of the other Irish and international shows on iProperty Radio.